In just 9 minutes on live national TV, J.D. Vance shattered Adam Kinzinger's carefully crafted mask and left 20 million Americans stunned, speechless, watching as a man so proud, so untouchable, fell to his knees in front of the entire nation. It happened not with fury, not with volume, but with something far more powerful, the quiet force of truth. What did J.D. Vance reveal that night? What truth was so raw, so undeniable, that it pierced through years of polished speeches and political armor? Tonight we take you inside that unforgettable moment, the confrontation that turned into a reckoning, and the words that echoed far beyond the studio walls. Before we begin, let us pause for a breath. This is a dramatized account inspired by themes of justice, courage, and accountability. The events and dialogue you're about to experience are fictional, but the emotions, the questions, and the longing for a better tomorrow are deeply real. In sharing this story, our hope is not just to entertain, but to reflect the struggles and hopes of everyday Americans. Now lean in, remember the silence that followed those 9 minutes, and ask yourself, what would make a man fall to his knees if not the undeniable weight of truth? Stay with us. Let the next few moments remind you why truth still matters and why courage can change a nation. It began in a moment that felt like the entire nation was holding its breath. Millions of Americans, from factory workers in Ohio to retirees in Florida, had tuned in for what was billed as a routine political debate. But what they witnessed instead would haunt the airwaves for days. Adam Kinzinger's voice sliced through the heavy quiet of the broadcast studio, sharp and cold like steel drawn in a duel. His words weren't just meant to challenge J.D. Vance's policies. They were meant to strip him bare in front of the nation. "You peddle false hope to desperate fools, J.D.," Adam hissed. His eyes narrowed, his shoulders tense with the eagerness of a man certain of victory. His voice carried the venom of a score he had long wanted to settle. "And tonight, I'll show them what you really are." The words echoed, lingering in the air like smoke. J.D. Vance sat still, as if carved from stone. No flicker of anger, no twitch of defensiveness crossed his face. His hands rested on the table, fingers lightly interlaced, knuckles pale but steady. The tension in the room was palpable, not the kind that crackles with energy, but the kind that weighs heavy on the chest, that makes even the most seasoned of moderators falter. And falter she did. The moderator cleared her throat, her voice trembling, a subtle betrayal of the pressure that now filled the studio. "Congressman Kinzinger, let's remember..." But Adam wasn't finished. He leaned forward, breaching the invisible boundary of civility that debates cling to. "The people watching at home deserve to know, J.D., deserve to see through that polished story you keep selling. Working class hero? Please, you've sold out this country's soul, piece by piece, all to get where you are, all for power." The words felt personal, too personal, the kind of attack that wasn't just about politics. Something deeper simmered beneath Adam's composure. A grudge, jealousy, or was it fear? J.D. didn't respond. Not yet. His silence became a force of its own, unsettling in its calm. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. And in that silence, something strange began to happen. The audience, both in the studio and across the millions of homes watching, leaned closer. They weren't listening to Adam's words anymore. They were watching J.D. What would he say? What would he do? Adam mistook that silence for weakness. His confidence swelled. He thought he had cornered J.D. Vance. "You parade yourself as the voice of the forgotten," Adam continued, his voice rising. "But tell them how you've abandoned those very people, how you've used their pain as a ladder. Tell them, J.D." The moderator tried again, her voice firmer but still edged with uncertainty. "Gentlemen, please, let's keep this focused on policy." But the room had already shifted. This was no longer a debate. This was something rawer, closer to a reckoning. And J.D., he remained still, silent, as if weighing not just his response, but the weight of what would come after. And in that breathless moment, one question began to stir quietly. First in the minds of the viewers, then on the lips of commentators who would later replay this exchange 100 times over. What could J.D. Vance possibly say that would answer this? And deeper still, why was he so calm? That's when J.D. Vance slowly, deliberately reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The motion so measured, so steady, it was as if time itself had slowed. His fingers touched something worn, something folded many times over. He drew it out, placed it on the table with quiet finality. A letter. The camera wouldn't need to zoom in. The power wasn't in seeing the paper. It was in seeing J.D.'s eyes, steady and unreadable. And just before he spoke, before a single word left his mouth, the nation leaned in as one. What truth was about to be unleashed? For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke. The weight of Adam Kinzinger's accusations still hung in the air, but it no longer filled the space with the power he intended. Instead, the room had shifted. The energy had coiled around J.D. Vance's silence, around that tattered letter he now laid before him, like a relic of something forgotten yet deeply important. Adam watched him, waiting for the rebuttal, the counterpunch, the fire, but none came. There was no anger in J.D.'s eyes, no smirk, no wounded pride, only a stillness that unnerved everyone in that room far more than any shouting match ever could. J.D. took a slow breath, his fingers gently smoothing the creases of the worn paper as if it were fragile, sacred even. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but low. The kind of voice that draws you in because it demands nothing, yet offers everything. "Before I answer," J.D. said, his gaze sweeping not just across the studio, but beyond, as if he were speaking to every home, every living room, every pair of eyes fixed on him at that very second. "I want America to hear this." And in that instant, the air seemed to thin. The world beyond the studio, the factories, the farms, the quiet kitchens where people gathered around TV sets, felt closer, as if somehow drawn into that small space, waiting for what came next. J.D. unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, each movement measured. The paper crackled softly, an intimate sound that, in the charged silence, felt louder than Adam's earlier accusations. "It was written by a man you've never heard of," J.D. began, his eyes never leaving the letter. "But you know him. You've seen him in every town that's been left behind, in every face worn down by promises that never came true." The moderator sat back, hands folded tightly, knowing better now than to interrupt. Even Adam, who just moments before had leaned forward with the hunger of a man sure of victory, found himself frozen, the fire in his eyes dimming as something older, more human, began to take its place. The faintest flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even shame. J.D.'s voice was clear, but soft enough that people leaned closer to their screens, afraid to miss a word. "If you're reading this," J.D. read, "I guess I couldn't hold out any longer. I tried. Lord knows I tried. But it's hard to fight when you're already forgotten. I applied in 3 states. No one's hiring. I prayed my boy wouldn't see what I've become. I hope he won't remember me like this. I hope he won't hate me for leaving." The words fell like stones into the stillness, each one rippling outward, stirring something deep in those who heard them. Adam shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his earlier confidence crumbling with every line. J.D. paused, his thumb tracing a worn edge of the letter, his breath slow and deliberate as he let the words settle not just in the room, but in the hearts of all who listened. He raised his eyes at last, not to Adam, not to the moderator, but to the unseen millions beyond the camera's gaze. This was written by an American, a father, a worker, a man this nation forgot. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of truth, of pain long ignored, of the unspoken question that now hung in the minds of every viewer. What will J.D. say next? And in that moment, the debate was no longer about J.D. Vance versus Adam Kinzinger. It was about a letter, a man, and the soul of a country that could no longer look away. J.D.'s voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The letter in his hands carried a weight that no fiery retort could match. And as he began to read, it was as if the air itself thickened, drawing every ear closer. The letter's paper trembled faintly between his fingers, not from nerves but from the gravity of what it contained, and the knowledge that these words would not be unheard tonight. "I don't know how to say this," J.D. read quietly, his eyes tracing each line as though seeing it anew, though the creases in the paper made clear how many times this letter had been unfolded, read, and folded again. "I've worked every day I could, in every place I could, for as long as I could. And now when my boy needs me most, I have nothing left to give. No job, no hope. Just this shame I carry like a weight on my back." The studio was silent. The cameras captured no rebuttal, no interruption, because none came. Adam Kinzinger, moments ago so sure of his moral high ground, sat frozen, his lips pressed thin, his gaze lowered, as though the words themselves had stripped away the armor he had worn onto that stage. J.D. paused, not for effect, but to steady his voice, to give the words room to breathe. The audience didn't need urging. They leaned forward of their own accord, drawn in by the rawness of the truth unfolding before them. "I promised him, promised him we'd get through this, that I'd find a way, that no matter what, I'd keep food on the table. I look at him now, and I don't know what to say. How do I tell a 7-year-old his dad can't provide? How do I make him understand it's not because I didn't try?" JD's voice softened further, as though speaking directly to that boy, as though the millions watching weren't even there. And in that moment, that boy wasn't just his father's son. He was the son of every family who'd been left behind, every household where hope had run dry. Adam shifted again, a small movement, but it spoke volumes. His earlier confidence had drained away, replaced by something harder to name: guilt, perhaps, or recognition, or fear of what this truth, so plainly spoken, would stir in the hearts of those watching. "If there's anything left to pray for, I pray that my boy won't hate me, that maybe one day, when he's older, he'll understand why I had to leave, why I couldn't face him anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, heavy, impossible to ignore. The letter's honesty cut through every defense, not just Adam's, but those of anyone who'd ever looked away from such suffering or dismissed it as someone else's burden. JD's hands were steady as he finished reading. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He let the letter speak in its own voice, a voice cracked by sorrow but unbroken by it. He folded the paper slowly, carefully, as though it might tear if handled too roughly, as though honoring the man who'd written it with that small act of respect. And when he finally looked up, his eyes glistened, not with tears shed, but with the weight of tears held back. The kind of tears that speak of a promise made silently to oneself, to carry this story forward, to make it matter. Across the country, in living rooms and kitchens, the silence on that stage reached into the hearts of those watching. For a moment, politics fell away. There was only a man, his son, and a nation left to reckon with the cost of forgetting its own. And still, no word from Adam. Because what could he say that wouldn't sound hollow against the echo of that letter? J.D. held the folded letter a moment longer, his thumb resting on its creased edge, as though feeling the burden of the words it carried before he dared to speak again. The silence was thick, heavy with what had already been said, but heavier still with what was yet to come. He unfolded the paper once more, hands steady, gaze lowered, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of softness that forces the world to lean in. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. But I can't watch my boy starve anymore." The sentence cut deeper than anything that had come before. There was no pretense left in these words, no attempt to shield pride or soften the truth. Only the raw desperation of a father who had fought as long as he could, and who, in the quiet of his own reckoning, had found himself defeated not by failure of effort, but by the indifference of a world that had stopped listening. J.D. let the words hang in the air, not rushing to fill the space they left behind. It was as though he understood that what mattered most now was not the speed of the story, but the weight of each line, the way it settled into the hearts of those who heard it. And across the country, those listening felt that weight, not as a distant sorrow, but as something personal, something that called into question their own comforts, their own silences. I've begged. I've worked where I could. I've sent out applications, made the calls, stood in line, heard the promises that led nowhere. I kept hoping. For months I kept hoping. But hope doesn't fill a plate. Hope doesn't pay the landlord. Hope doesn't quiet my son's hunger at night. The words were plain. They weren't dressed in rhetoric or shaped for applause, and that was what made them impossible to ignore. JD continued, his voice never rising, never pleading, because the letter itself did all the pleading that needed to be done. So if I leave this world tonight, it's not because I didn't love him. It's because I loved him too much to let him watch me fall apart one day at a time. And in that moment, the story JD read ceased to be just the story of one man. It became a mirror held up to a nation that prided itself on strength and resilience, forcing it to see the quiet tragedies it too often overlooked. JD's hands lowered slightly, the letter trembling now, not from his grip, but from the magnitude of what had been spoken aloud. Still, he didn't look up. Not yet. He gave the words the space they deserved, the space to echo, to settle, to wound. And in that space, Adam Kinzinger, the audience, and every soul watching found themselves asking the same unspoken question. What kind of country lets this happen? The final words of the father's letter hung in the air like an echo no one dared disturb. JD's hands rested lightly on the folded paper, as though even now it demanded reverence. He hadn't looked up yet, and in that moment, no one in the studio, no one watching across the country wanted him to. It was as if lifting his gaze would break a fragile spell, a spell woven from sorrow, truth, and the painful clarity that had descended on everyone who'd heard those words. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, almost tangible, filled with the weight of what had just been spoken. In the audience behind the stage lights, where moments before there had been shifting in seats, whispered comments, the occasional forced chuckle at a pointed jab, now there was nothing. People sat motionless, their eyes fixed on JD, their breaths shallow. Some had tears pooling at the corners of their eyes, not wiped away, because wiping them would mean acknowledging them, and somehow that felt too raw, too soon. In homes across America, in cluttered living rooms, in small-town diners with TVs mounted high on the wall, in city apartments where neighbors could hear the broadcast through thin walls, the same stillness had settled. The letter's honesty had crossed every boundary, erased every division, if only for this fleeting moment. It was no longer J.D. Vance on that stage. It was every forgotten voice he had just given life to. And Adam Kinzinger, the man who had just minutes ago spoken with such confidence, such certainty, now sat as if the very ground beneath him had shifted. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched beneath the table, unseen by the cameras but known to him. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, then another at his brow, tracing a slow path downward, unnoticed by him but not by those who watched closely. His gaze flicked down, then sideways as though searching for an anchor, something to hold on to in this sea of truth that had swept away the stage's carefully constructed lines of attack. He shifted in his seat, the motion small but betraying volumes. Gone was the assured posture, the forward lean of a man ready to strike. In its place was the uneasy tension of someone who realized too late that the battle he thought he was fighting wasn't the one unfolding before him. JD remained still. His silence now felt as powerful as the letter itself. He wasn't playing for effect, wasn't savoring a victory. There was no triumph in his posture, no satisfaction in the stunned faces before him. Only a quiet respect for the man whose voice he had borrowed, and perhaps a silent vow that this moment wouldn't be allowed to fade as so many had before. The moderator, who had earlier struggled to control the escalating tension, now sat frozen herself, her prepared notes forgotten, her practiced cues meaningless against the tide of emotion that had overtaken the room. She glanced toward JD, then toward Adam, but found no place to intervene. And across the nation, that shared stillness carried with it a question few had the courage to voice, but all felt deep within. How had it come to this? How had a nation allowed this story to exist? Not as fiction, but as the lived reality of its own people. The debate, the scorekeeping, the rehearsed lines, all of it had fallen away. stripped bare by a father's desperate words, read aloud by a man who refused to let them be forgotten. And in that stillness, the weight of what had been revealed pressed down on everyone, leaving them with no place to look except inward. JD's fingers lingered for a moment on the letter's worn edges, as though reluctant to let go of the voice it carried. The studio's silence remained unbroken, the kind of silence that wasn't absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, the collective weight of truth settling onto every shoulder. Slowly, deliberately, JD folded the paper, smoothing each crease with care, as if honoring the man who had written it with that small final gesture. His voice when he spoke was steady, measured, yet there was an unmistakable undercurrent, the quiet fury of a man who had carried this burden too long without speaking it aloud. That father ended his life last winter. The words landed with the force of a hammer, though JD spoke them softly. There was no need for volume. The truth carried its own power. He paused, not for effect, but because even now, saying it aloud felt like reopening a wound that never truly healed. His son, 7 years old, found him. A faint gasp broke the silence. From where, no one could tell. Perhaps it came from the studio audience, perhaps from a producer watching from behind the cameras, or perhaps it echoed from living rooms across the country, where viewers felt their own hearts clench at the image of a child forced to bear a grief too large for his small shoulders. JD let the pause stretch just long enough for the weight of it to sink in. His gaze didn't search for Adam, didn't challenge him. This wasn't about political points anymore. It was about the boy, about every child left behind by promises unkept and systems that looked the other way. That boy, JD continued, his voice unwavering, though his eyes glistened under the studio lights, still waits for justice. The atmosphere shifted again. Not lighter, not yet, but heavier still. Grief filled the room, thick and undeniable. But beneath it, another current began to stir. Anger, the quiet, smoldering kind that builds when sorrow meets truth and recognizes the cost of silence. Adam's posture had changed entirely. His earlier certainty had melted away, leaving him pale beneath the bright lights. The sweat on his brow now traced paths down his temples, unnoticed, unchecked. He opened his mouth once, as if to speak, but no words came. What could be said? What defense could stand against the simple, brutal clarity of what JD had shared? JD glanced at the folded letter one final time before setting it gently on the table. His hands rested beside it, empty now, but carrying more than they had at the start of the night. The burden wasn't his alone. He had simply given it voice. And as that voice echoed in the hearts of those watching, it demanded more than sympathy. It demanded reflection. It demanded change. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, as though realizing that no prepared question, no neutral prompt could bridge the chasm that now lay between what had been planned and what had unfolded. And in homes across America, people found themselves gripped not by policy points or debate tactics, but by the raw truth that had been placed before them. The image of that boy, 7 years old, standing alone in the cold of last winter, waiting still for someone, anyone, to say, "We see you, we hear you, we will not look away." And though JD said nothing further in that moment, the message was clear. The night's debate had become something else entirely. Not a contest of words, but a call to conscience. And the question left hanging, unspoken but felt by all, was no longer who won. It was, what will we do now? The studio's silence clung to the air, thick with the weight of JD's revelation. The folded letter sat on the table like a relic, small and worn but somehow larger than anything else in the room. JD's hands rested beside it, his eyes steady, his voice quiet but unshakable. And across America, hearts still echoed with the image of that boy, 7 years old, standing alone in the shadow of loss. It was Adam who finally broke the silence, though his voice betrayed him the moment he spoke. Gone was the sharp, commanding tone of the man who had begun the night certain of his footing. In its place was a hollow echo of that confidence, a voice that tried to sound sure but faltered under the weight of what had been laid bare. We have to talk about policy," Adam stammered, his eyes flicking toward the moderator as though searching for refuge for a reset that wouldn't come. Economic policy, jobs, we can't let emotions cloud the real issues. But the words rang empty, falling flat against the raw truth JD had shared. Adam tried to rally, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself, but his gaze didn't meet JD's. He looked past him, around him, anywhere but into the eyes of the man who had just given voice to the voiceless. The economy, Adam pressed on, his words quickening as if speed might cover the cracks in his argument. It's complex. We can't blame the system for every individual tragedy. People have to take responsibility too. We we can't build policy on isolated stories, no matter how tragic they may be. JD didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any rebuttal could have, and that silence made Adam's defense crumble further, each word he uttered sounding more hollow than the last. The moderator shifted in her seat, her expression caught between professional neutrality and the human reaction that no one in the room could entirely suppress. She glanced at Adam, then at JD, then at the cameras, as if realizing that no prompt or pivot could steer the moment back to the safe, rehearsed terrain of political talking points. Adam's hands trembled slightly now, his knuckles white where they gripped the table. The sweat that had begun at his brow now traced its way down his face, unheeded. His collar seemed tighter, the lights hotter, the room smaller. "Look," Adam said, his voice lowering, trying for reason, for calm, but finding little to stand on. "We all want to help families like that, but it has to be through sound economic principles. We can't govern on feelings." And yet, as the words left his mouth, even he seemed to hear how empty they were. They hung there, feeble and fragile, in stark contrast to the father's letter that had filled the room with such undeniable truth. JD remained still, his eyes steady, his presence quiet but unyielding. There was no triumph in his posture, no satisfaction in watching Adam struggle. There was only the same quiet conviction that had carried him through the reading of the letter. The sense that this wasn't about winning or losing, but about seeing at last what too many had chosen not to see. Across the country, viewers felt the shift. The debate was no longer a contest of points and counterpoints. It had become a reckoning, not just for Adam, but for every comfortable narrative that had been used to excuse the inexcusable. And in that reckoning, Adam's words, no matter how many he spoke, could not fill the silence JD's truth had left behind. For a moment after Adam's words fell away, the room seemed suspended in that same heavy silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of sorrow. It was the silence that comes just before the storm, when the air shifts and you can feel that something is about to break. JD didn't rush. He didn't leap on Adam's faltering defense. Instead, he let the weight of the moment settle, let Adam's hollow arguments echo and fade into the space where truth was waiting to take its place. When JD spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried a new edge, not of anger, but of clarity, sharpened by grief. "You want to talk about policy?" JD began, his gaze finally lifting, steady and unblinking, fixed not on Adam's eyes but on the hollow place his words had left behind. "Fine, let's talk about policy. Let's talk about what happens when promises get broken." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quiet force of his words drew in every ear, every heart, every viewer waiting for him to speak what they themselves had felt, but perhaps never voiced. 3 million manufacturing jobs lost in a single decade. Entire towns gutted. Main streets boarded up, schools closing, churches empty. Communities that once thrived on hard work reduced to lines at food banks, to kids going to bed hungry while executives collect bonuses for outsourcing livelihoods overseas. The facts came not as statistics, but as accusations. Not against Adam alone, but against every system, every policy that had allowed those numbers to become lives broken and futures stolen. JD's voice sharpened, each word cutting cleaner, deeper. "You talk about sound economic principles. What sound principle ships jobs to countries that pay workers pennies so a CEO can buy a third yacht? What sound principle lets corporations write their own rules, while the people who built this country are told to wait their turn for help that never comes? Adam said nothing. There was nothing to say. His earlier stammering had evaporated entirely, leaving him pale and still beneath the bright lights. JD's voice dropped lower, but the force of it only grew. "You didn't insult me, Adam." The words hit like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, touching everyone in the room, everyone watching at home. "You insulted him, that father. You insulted her, the mother working double shifts and still coming up short. You insulted every American who's been left behind, who's been told their pain is just an isolated story, who's been told to be patient while they watch everything they've worked for slip away." His hands rested flat on the table now, steady, unmoving. There was no need to gesture. The truth was enough. "You call that emotion, I call it reality." And with that, the room shifted again. The audience, the moderator, the millions watching, they weren't listening to a debate anymore. They were witnessing something else entirely, a reckoning, a reminder, a man refusing to let the forgotten remain forgotten. Adam looked down, the weight of JD's words settling over him like a storm he could neither outrun nor deny. His earlier fire was gone. In its place was only the knowledge that this night would not be remembered for his arguments, but for the truth he had failed to answer. And still JD remained composed. His voice, his words, his presence, all steady, all unyielding, as if he had decided long before this moment that no attack, no evasion would shake his purpose tonight. JD's final words settled over the studio like a heavy fog, impossible to see through, impossible to ignore. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. His truth had done what no volume or anger could. The room felt smaller now, as if drawn inward by the weight of what had been said. Adam sat motionless, his hands clenched beneath the table where the cameras couldn't see. But the cameras didn't need to see his hands. They captured his eyes, darting, unfocused, searching for refuge in a space where none remained. The lights seemed harsher now, the stage less sure. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on Adam's brow, tracing slow lines down his temples, his cheeks. He shifted in his seat, not with the controlled confidence of a statesman, but with the unease of a man who realized too late that his arguments had failed him. His discomfort was no longer hidden behind talking points or practiced smiles. It was plain, and the cameras caught it all. And beyond the studio walls, America was watching. Every word, every pause, every glance was being captured, clipped, shared. Social media feeds erupted in real time. Clips of JD's quiet, piercing stand flooded timelines. His words, "You didn't insult me. You insulted him, and her, and every American left behind," were replayed again and again, each time hitting harder, each time reaching more ears, more hearts. Posts poured in from every corner of the country. A mother in Michigan shared the video with the caption, "Finally someone speaking for us." A veteran in West Virginia wrote, "I haven't felt proud watching politics in years. Tonight I did." From small towns to big cities, the nation didn't just hear JD's words, they felt them. In living rooms, in kitchens, in break rooms where late shift workers paused for just a moment, the debate had transformed. It was no longer about JD Vance and Adam Kinzinger. It was about all of them. It was about every promise made and broken, every hope raised and abandoned. And as viewers watched Adam squirm beneath the lights, beneath the gaze of a nation now fully awake, they saw in him not just a politician losing ground, but a symbol of the excuses they'd heard too often, the deflections that had done nothing to ease their struggles. The moderator, so eager at the start to keep the conversation on schedule, now sat quietly, letting the moment breathe, letting the truth JD had unleashed settle into every corner of that room. There were no follow-up questions that could capture what had just unfolded. No pivot that could return this debate to the neat, rehearsed exchanges that had been expected. Adam opened his mouth once, as if to speak, but no words came. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind searching for a foothold on ground that no longer existed. His discomfort, his defeat, played out not in dramatic gestures or outbursts, but in the slow collapse of a man unprepared to face the truth laid bare before him. And JD? JD sat quietly now, his work done, his point made not through attack, but through clarity. He didn't need to speak again. The nation had heard him. More importantly, they had seen him. A man who refused to let the forgotten stay forgotten, who had taken the stage not to win points, but to remind his country of what it owed its own people. As the debate wore on, the questions that followed felt hollow, the answers rehearsed, the urgency gone. Because for those watching, the real debate had already ended. And as the night stretched on, one truth remained. JD's words would echo far beyond this stage, far beyond this night. The weight of JD's words still hung in the air, their echo lingering far beyond the studio walls. Across the country, millions continued to watch, gripped by what felt less like a debate and more like a reckoning. But even as the atmosphere thickened with the truth JD had laid bare, Adam Kinzinger wasn't ready to surrender the stage. Not yet. His pride, his training, his instinct as a seasoned politician wouldn't allow it. Adam straightened in his chair, drawing a breath as if he could summon back the confidence that had evaporated beneath JD's quiet onslaught. His gaze flickered briefly toward the cameras, then settled somewhere just above JD's shoulder, close enough to seem engaged, far enough to avoid the full force of JD's steady eyes. "We have to be careful," Adam began, his voice steadier than before, though it carried the thin edge of strain. "Careful that we don't let moments like this divide us further. This country's been through enough division, enough anger. We can't afford to turn working Americans against each other." He paused, hoping the words would land, hoping the familiar appeal to unity might find fertile ground. But as he spoke, it was clear the room remained unmoved. The audience, the moderator, the viewers at home, all still carried the weight of JD's truth, and Adam's attempt to reframe it felt, in comparison, hollow. "I respect your passion, JD," Adam continued, his tone shifting towards something almost conciliatory. "But stoking resentment, painting businesses, leaders, neighbors as villains, that's not how we fix what's broken. That's how we break it further. We need solutions, not blame." The words were practiced, polished from years of debates and town halls, but tonight they fell flat, like stones skipping once on the surface of a deep lake before sinking out of sight. The truth was too fresh, too raw for platitudes to find purchase. JD didn't interrupt. He didn't frown or shake his head. He didn't need to. His stillness spoke for him, a presence so steady and composed, it seemed to fill the room, to leave no space for spin or evasion. Where Adam's words scattered, looking for something to cling to, JD's silence held firm, grounded in the weight of what had already been said. The moderator shifted, sensing the futility in Adam's effort, but bound by duty to let him finish. The cameras, ever faithful, captured every flicker of Adam's discomfort, the way his hands, once confident, now fidgeted with the edge of his notes, the way his eyes darted as though seeking an escape. "We have to move forward together," Adam said, his voice softening further, as if hoping that lowering it might add sincerity where conviction had faltered. "That's the only way." But across the country, viewers saw through it. They saw a man clinging to the last tools of a playbook that no longer applied, offering unity as a shield against accountability, urging togetherness as a way to quiet the truth rather than confront it. JD remained as he had been, calm, composed, his presence filling not just the room, but the hearts of those watching. He hadn't needed to say another word. His stand had already spoken louder than anything Adam could muster. And as Adam's voice trailed off, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was resolute. The nation wasn't waiting for Adam's unity speech. It was waiting for JD's next truth. Adam's words faded into the air, their echoes weak and scattered, like leaves caught in a wind that had long since changed direction. The room remained hushed, the weight of expectation hanging over everyone present. It was clear now, to all who watched, that no polished phrase or appeal to unity could match the force of truth that had already been laid bare. The cameras held their focus on JD, who sat still, composed, the calm at the center of a storm he had not created but refused to ignore. And then at last JD spoke. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't demand attention, but commanded it all the same. "I don't need your apology." The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of iron. JD wasn't looking for Adam's regret, not tonight. His eyes, steady and clear, weren't fixed on Adam alone. They seemed to look through him, beyond the man, beyond the cameras, to the faces of all those who had been forgotten, left behind, silenced by years of empty promises. "But tonight," JD continued, his voice never rising, never faltering, "your conscience must kneel before the people you forgot." The sentence struck with the quiet thunder of undeniable truth. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just words so precise, so cutting, they left no room for deflection. In that moment, JD did not speak as a candidate or a politician or even as a man defending himself. He spoke as the voice of those who had no stage, no microphone, no chance to be heard. The atmosphere thickened again, charged with a tension more powerful than any shouted debate. The audience, the moderator, the nation watching, all seemed to draw in a collective breath, as if bracing for the impact of words that needed no embellishment. JD's gaze never wavered. His presence filled the room, not with bluster or bravado, but with the simple, unstoppable strength of conviction. Where Adam had tried to pivot, to reframe, to escape, JD stood firm, rooted in the truth that had carried him to this moment. "This isn't about me," JD said, his voice soft but unshakable. "It never was. This is about every worker whose job was shipped overseas while politicians held press conferences. Every child who went to bed hungry while corporate profits soared. Every family who waited for help that never came." The words did not accuse, they revealed. And in revealing, they left no room for pretense, no shelter for those who had turned away. The moderator said nothing. She too felt the weight of what had just been spoken, understood that no question she asked could match the gravity of what had unfolded. Across the country, people sat in stunned silence, not out of confusion, but out of recognition. JD had not delivered a blow to Adam alone. He had delivered a reminder to a nation too long distracted from its own reflection. And as the seconds ticked by, as the cameras kept rolling, it became clear that this was no longer about who would win the debate. JD had already won something far more lasting: the attention, the respect, and perhaps the awakening of a people who had, for too long, been made to feel invisible. The room felt as if it had stopped breathing. JD's words, "Your conscience must kneel before the people you forgot," echoed in the silence like a bell tolling in the night. Impossible to unhear, impossible to outrun. Adam sat motionless, the weight of that truth pressing down on him, heavier than the lights, heavier than the cameras, heavier than the expectations he'd carried onto that stage, the polished mask he had worn for so long, the practiced smile, the sure tone, the confidence of a man who knew how to navigate any debate, began to crack. First in the slight tremor of his hands as they rested on the table, then in the quick, shallow breaths he struggled to steady. His eyes glistened now, not from the glare of the lights, but from the flood of emotions rising faster than he could contain. For a heartbeat, he tried to gather himself, tried to summon a defense, a retort, even a deflection. But none came. The usual tools, the talking points, the pivots, the polished lines, all lay useless at his feet, no match for the quiet force JD had unleashed. His voice, when it finally emerged, was no longer the voice of a seasoned politician. It was not the voice of a man trying to win. It was the voice of a man stripped bare, facing the truth he could no longer deny. "I'm sorry." The words were barely louder than a whisper, but they filled the space like thunder, simple, raw, unguarded. The words of a man who had reached the limits of defense and found at last the courage to lay down his pride. Adam's gaze dropped, no longer able to meet JD's steady eyes. His shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment bending him forward as if he could no longer bear to stand tall beneath it. Slowly, haltingly, he lowered himself in his chair, his posture no longer that of a man at a podium, but of one brought low by the realization of his own failings. The studio remained silent, the audience frozen not out of shock, but out of respect for the rawness of what they witnessed. The moderator, her prepared notes forgotten, watched with wide, unblinking eyes, understanding that no scripted question could add to this moment, no follow-up could match its depth. Across America, those watching felt the shift. This was no longer about sides, no longer about points scored or debates won. It was about a reckoning long overdue. People sat still, some with tears they did not wipe away, others with hearts pounding from the weight of shared sorrow and perhaps shared hope. Adam swallowed hard, his voice breaking again as he tried, haltingly, to find more words. I didn't see. I thought I did, but I didn't. There was no art in his confession, no polish, just the fractured sentences of a man trying to speak through the storm inside him. J.D. said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Steady, patient, unflinching. He hadn't sought Adam's apology, and yet here it was, offered not as strategy, but as the only response left when truth had done its work. And in that moment, with the cameras rolling, with the nation watching, Adam's breaking point became something more. A glimpse of what humility might look like when all pretense is stripped away, when one man finally sees what he should have seen all along. For a breathless moment, the studio held its silence, as if the world had stopped to absorb what had just unfolded. Adam's quiet, broken apology lingered in the air, its raw sincerity filling the space far more powerfully than any speech or argument ever could. J.D. remained still, his presence steady, his gaze soft but unwavering. No one moved. No one dared disturb the fragile peace that had settled like a blanket over the room. And then, as if the tension had finally found its release, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow at first, hesitant, as though afraid to break the spell, but then joined by another and another, until the entire studio erupted into thunderous applause. The sound rose, filled the room, and echoed beyond the walls, as if those clapping weren't simply responding to what had happened on stage, but to something deeper, something that had long gone unsaid, unseen, unacknowledged. The applause wasn't for a political victory. It wasn't for a clever line or a debate point scored. It was for the truth, for humility, for a moment that transcended sides, that reminded everyone watching what it meant to see each other, truly see each other, in all our shared struggle, sorrow, and hope. J.D. didn't stand. He didn't raise his hand or gesture for quiet. He simply let the applause wash over him, over Adam, over the letter still resting folded on the table like a silent witness to it all. His expression didn't change. It didn't need to. His message had been delivered, not with triumph, but with purpose. And now it belonged to everyone who had heard it. In homes across America, the response was just as visceral. People who hadn't planned to watch, who had tuned in out of habit or curiosity, now found themselves on their feet, clapping through tears that fell unchecked. In a small-town diner in Indiana, truckers and teachers and nurses stood side by side, united by something far greater than politics. In a New York apartment, a grandmother wiped her eyes, her hands trembling, as she whispered, "It's about time." Social media, moments earlier filled with clips and commentary, grew strangely quiet. Not because people had nothing to say, but because they were searching for the words to match what they felt. The usual commentators, the analysts with their prepared notes and practiced reactions, were left speechless. Some blinked into the cameras, struggling to find footing in the aftermath of a moment so raw, so real that it defied their familiar scripts. The moderator, her voice soft and unsteady, finally spoke, but only after the applause had begun to ebb, its echoes still warm in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think any of us expected this tonight, but maybe it's exactly what we needed." And in that simple acknowledgement, the truth of the evening settled into the hearts of all who witnessed it. This hadn't been a debate. It hadn't been a contest. It had been a reckoning, not of policies, but of conscience. A reminder that beneath the rhetoric and the noise, there are stories, there is pain, and there is the hope that, together, we might begin to heal. As the cameras panned across the studio, faces glistened with tears. The applause lingered in memory, not as a sound, but as a promise that the people's voice, the true voice, had been heard and that it would not be forgotten. As the applause slowly faded, its echoes lingering in the studio like the warmth of an embrace, JD remained seated, his posture unchanged. He didn't soak in the moment, didn't bask in the recognition. His eyes stayed steady, focused, not on the faces before him, but on something greater, the responsibility that the night had laid bare. The room grew quiet again, but this time it was not the heavy silence of sorrow or tension. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are ready to listen, ready to hear what truly matters. JD drew a slow, steady breath, as if gathering not his strength, but his resolve. He turned at last toward the cameras, his gaze clear, unwavering. It wasn't the look of a man seeking attention. It was the look of a man determined to speak directly to every heart watching. "We don't need apologies." The words came softly but carried a strength that filled the room. There was no bitterness in his tone, no triumph in his expression. Only truth, plain and undeniable. "We need action." The pause that followed wasn't for effect. It was the natural pause of a man letting the weight of his words settle. For that boy, for all our children, for every family who has waited too long, hoped too long, been told too many times to be patient while the world moves on without them. His voice remained even, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath his calm. It wasn't the fire of anger, it was the fire of conviction, the steady, enduring flame that comes from knowing the cost of silence and the price of delay. Tonight can't end here, not in applause, not in emotion. It has to end in promise, a promise that we will stop looking away, that we will stop excusing injustice because it's inconvenient or because it challenges what we thought we knew. JD's gaze seemed to reach through the camera, as if seeking out each viewer where they sat, in their homes, their workplaces, their cars parked on quiet streets as they listened to the broadcast, unable to turn it off. We owe that father more than sympathy. We owe that boy more than sorrow. We owe them, and so many like them, a future where no child has to carry the burden of hunger or watch a parent fall under the weight of despair. A future where our work means something, where our promises are kept. His hands rested lightly on the table, his posture open, honest. He didn't gesture for effect, didn't need to. The truth of what he spoke was enough. "I stand here tonight not asking for your vote, not asking for your favor. I stand here asking for your heart, for your courage, for your commitment, because this isn't about one man or one debate. It's about all of us and what kind of country we choose to be, not in speeches, not in moments like this, but in the days that follow, when the cameras are off and the applause has faded." The studio remained still, captivated. The moderator, commentators, audience, all knew instinctively that no question could follow. No analysis could capture what JD had given them. Across the nation, viewers sat in quiet reflection, the power of his words filling spaces where empty rhetoric had too often lived. And as the seconds ticked on, one truth was clear. JD's message hadn't just ended the debate, it had begun something far greater, a call that could not be unheard, a reminder of the promise they owed each other. JD's final words hadn't just ended a debate, they had sparked something larger, something no one could have fully predicted. As the cameras faded to outro music and the studio lights dimmed, the real event was only beginning. Across America, those words, "We don't need apologies, we need action," spread like wildfire, carried by voices eager to share what they'd witnessed, by hearts stirred from long slumber, by the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this night had changed something. Within minutes, social media lit up, not with the usual snark and sound bites, but with clips of JD's speech shared and reshared millions of times over. The words reach beyond political divides, beyond regions, beyond generations. They found their way into the feeds of the disillusioned, the weary, the hopeful. People who had long stopped believing that anyone spoke for them found in JD's quiet conviction a voice they recognized. The father's letter, that folded worn paper JD had held with such care, became more than a symbol of sorrow. It became a banner of truth, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Comment threads filled with stories. A mother in Ohio who'd worked 2 jobs after the factory closed, posting, "He spoke for me tonight." A veteran in Texas who'd lost his farm and shared, "That boy's father was me once. Thank you for seeing us." News outlets scrambled to keep up. The clips aired on endless loops, commentators finding themselves at a rare loss for words. The usual volley of analysis and spin gave way for once to quiet respect. "Tonight," one anchor finally managed to say during a late-night segment, "we witnessed something rare, a moment that wasn't about winning, but about seeing each other. Really seeing each other." JD's campaign office, quiet before the debate, now pulsed with life. Emails, letters, calls poured in by the thousands. Messages not of praise for JD himself, but of gratitude for the man whose letter he'd shared, and for the boy whose loss had reminded a nation of its forgotten. Staffers read aloud some of the messages as they came in, their voices thick with emotion. "Please tell him thank you for speaking for us. I never thought anyone would say what we've lived through. Where can we help? What can we do?" And the dead father's letter, that humble, heart-worn testament, took on a new life. It was printed on posters carried at rallies, quoted on signs in small towns and big cities alike. Teachers shared it with their students. Clergy read from it in sermons. Families framed its words and placed them where they could see them each morning, as a reminder, as a promise. In communities where hope had been thin, JD's speech became a rallying cry. Town meetings that once drew a handful now filled school gyms. People spoke of plans, of ideas, of working together not for applause but for change. The boy's story, and the father's, had given their struggle a name, a face, a voice. And through it all, JD stayed quiet in his public remarks, choosing not to feed the media frenzy, not to claim victory or seek the spotlight. He let the nation carry the message forward, as it always should have. He knew that no single speech could heal the wounds of a nation. But he also knew that every movement starts with a moment, and that moment had come. As the sun rose the next morning over cities and small towns alike, one truth was clear. JD's words had not ended the conversation. They had begun one, and this time, the nation was ready to listen. The morning after JD's speech, while the nation was still absorbing the emotional weight of his words, the machinery of politics roared to life. The same commentators who had fallen silent in the immediate aftermath now found their footing, their voices sharpened by old habits. Headlines appeared on screens and newsstands alike. Populist stunt or genuine call? JD Vance, hero or demagogue? Can one speech save a nation? The political elite, blindsided by JD's ability to connect with ordinary Americans, scrambled to reframe the narrative. Pundits dissected his speech, searching for fault lines. Some accused JD of exploiting tragedy for political gain. Others suggested he'd oversimplified complex issues, appealing to emotion at the expense of reason. Think pieces flooded the op-ed pages, warning of the dangers of divisive rhetoric dressed as unity. But while those in power worked to discredit him, something unexpected unfolded beyond the halls of influence. The people, the very Americans JD had spoken for, stood up. Town halls that once struggled to fill seats now overflowed, with workers, veterans, parents, and students packing into school gyms, libraries, and community centers. They didn't come for spectacle. They came because someone had named their pain, had shown them that their struggles weren't isolated, weren't invisible. At one gathering in a small town long forgotten by campaign buses, a retired steelworker rose and spoke, his voice trembling, not from age but from emotion. "We've been waiting for someone to say what JD said. We've been waiting too long." His words were met with applause that shook the room, not in volume, but in conviction. The harder the elites tried to discredit JD, the stronger the people's resolve became. They saw through the talking points, the polished dismissals. They knew authenticity when they heard it, and no amount of spin could convince them otherwise. JD, for his part, stayed the course. He didn't lash out at his critics, didn't feed the media storm. Instead, he went where the cameras didn't follow, to the places the letter's father might have once worked, lived, prayed. His mission was clear: keep the focus on the people, not the politics. And as the backlash grew louder, so too did the quiet but steady chorus of Americans who stood with him, ready to fight not for a man, but for the change he had given voice to. One overcast morning, without the presence of cameras or press, JD slipped away from the glare of headlines and town halls to make a visit that had weighed on him since the night of the debate. The boy, the 7-year-old who had found his father's lifeless body, whose story had stirred a nation, lived in a modest, weathered house on the edge of a small town few maps noted anymore. JD knocked softly, uncertain what he could offer, knowing only that he had to come. The door opened to reveal the boy's aunt, who had stepped in to raise him after tragedy had shattered their world. She didn't smile, but she nodded, understanding more in that moment than words could say. She stepped aside and JD entered the home. The boy sat at the kitchen table, small hands gripping a pencil, head bent over a piece of paper. When he looked up, his eyes were wide, not with awe, but with the kind of quiet strength born of surviving what no child should. JD knelt so they were eye to eye. "Hi," JD said gently. "I wanted to meet you." The boy nodded, silent but steady. He held up the paper, a simple drawing of a man standing beneath a bright sun, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy. The figures were rough, childlike, but the message clear. The boy's memory of his father, preserved in lines and color that spoke more than words ever could. "I made it for him," the boy said, his voice small. "But maybe you can have it, since you said his words." JD took the drawing as if it were made of glass, his throat tight, his heart heavy with the weight of that trust. "I'll keep it safe," and he promised. "And I'll remember, always." They sat in quiet for a while. No speeches, no promises beyond what mattered. And when JD left, he did so with more than a drawing. He carried with him a renewed vow, etched in the image of a father and son, to make sure the boy's loss would not be in vain. In the weeks that followed, JD turned from speeches to action. The father's letter and the boy's drawing became the unseen fuel behind long hours drafting legislation designed to do more than make headlines. Designed to protect American jobs, rebuild communities, and restore dignity to work that had been too long devalued. The bill wasn't flashy. It didn't promise miracles. It promised fairness. Tax incentives for companies that kept jobs on American soil, penalties for those that shipped them overseas while collecting federal contracts, support for small businesses trying to stay afloat in hollowed-out towns. JD titled it the Promise Act, a name that spoke not to politics but to the duty owed to people like the father in the letter and the son who carried on his memory. What surprised many was what came next. Adam Kinzinger, the man who had once clashed with JD under the bright lights of a debate stage, stepped forward. Without fanfare, without press releases, he asked to co-sponsor the bill. Some thought it was penance. Others saw it as political strategy. But those who had truly watched that fateful night understood. It was humility. It was growth. It was the first fragile bloom of unity where division had once taken root. Together, JD and Adam presented the bill, standing side by side not as rivals, but as men who had chosen to put the people before the politics. The media tried to spin it, tried to frame it as strange bedfellows, as an uneasy alliance. But Americans watching saw something else entirely. They saw the seeds of reform being planted not in speeches, but in deeds. Town halls continued to fill. The applause that had once rung out for a speech now rang out for legislation, for action, for the rare sight of leaders remembering who they served. And while the road ahead remained long, uncertain, and difficult, one truth had been made clear. A letter, a boy's drawing, and the courage to speak had started something no force of politics could stop. Months passed, and with them came change. Not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in small, steady steps that spoke louder than any promise ever could. In towns where silence had once filled empty streets, the hum of machinery returned as long-shuttered factories reopened their doors. Smokestacks that had stood cold and lifeless for years now rose against the sky with quiet defiance, their trails of smoke a sign not of pollution, but of purpose restored. Families who had known only worry and waiting began to find their footing once more. Paychecks replaced pink slips. The fear that had settled deep in their bones began to lift, little by little, replaced by the fragile but growing hope that this time the change might last. In the town that the father's letter had brought to the nation's attention, the healing was slow but real. The boarded-up shops found new owners. The schoolyard, once quiet, rang again with the laughter of children who sensed, without knowing why, that the future had brightened. Neighbors gathered not to mourn what was lost, but to rebuild what could be saved. And though no law could erase the pain of the past, the signs of recovery were everywhere, not in headlines or sound bites, but in the simple, everyday acts of people reclaiming their lives, their dignity, their dreams. The day of the bill's signing came not with fanfare, but with solemn purpose. JD stood at the podium, the text of the Promise Act before him, the weight of the journey behind him, and the eyes of a nation upon him. Cameras broadcast his image from coast to coast, but it wasn't the cameras he spoke to. It was the people, the families, the workers, the children who deserved more than words. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering as he began. Let this letter forever remind us, our strength is in our people. We will never again forget them. The room was silent but for the sound of pens scratching as the bill became law, and JD's words settled into the hearts of those who listened, not as rhetoric, but as a promise made in full view of history. He spoke not of victory, but of duty, not of what had been achieved, but of what must come next. We are measured not by the wealth we build, but by the lives we lift, he said, and across the nation, viewers felt the truth of it. It wasn't a speech designed to impress, it was a speech meant to last, and it did. That moment became a defining chapter in the story of a nation, replayed in classrooms, cited in sermons, remembered by those who had once felt invisible. The letter's legacy had become the people's legacy, and JD's words echoed far beyond that single day. Long after the cameras had turned away, long after the speeches and ceremonies had faded into memory, JD made a quiet journey that no one reported, no one filmed. Alone, he walked the gentle rise of a small cemetery on the edge of the father's hometown, where the wind carried the scent of pine and the promise of spring. He found the grave easily. There was no grand marker, no elaborate stone, just a simple name, a pair of dates too close together, and a space where grass had begun to grow back after the winter's frost. JD stood for a moment, his hands in his pockets, his head bowed not in show, but in respect. Then slowly he knelt and laid the boy's drawing at the base of the marker. The image of a man and a child beneath a bright sun. Lines faded now from the boy's small hands, holding it so often. JD's voice was low, meant not for the world, but for the man whose courage had sparked a movement. Your son is safe now, he said. Your voice changed a nation. The wind rose, gentle but sure, rustling the paper, the grass, the flag that flew nearby. It carried JD's words, carried the promise, carried the memory of one man's letter that had reminded a country of its soul. And as JD stood and turned to leave, the flag flew free against the wide, open sky, a quiet tribute to a quiet hero. This story reminds us that true change begins when we choose to see each other, not as numbers or headlines, but as neighbors, as family. JD's courage showed that words can awaken a nation, but action is what builds its future. When we listen, when we act, we heal. What's one promise you believe we should all make to each other today? Let's reflect together. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.